Welcome to Inclusion Matters, a podcast about children's development from the Center for Inclusive Childcare.
Welcome to Inclusion Matters, a podcast from the Center for Inclusive Childcare. I'm Priscilla Weigel, the Executive Director, and I'm here today with our guest, Dr. Jennifer Hall-Lande from the University of Minnesota Institute on Community Integration. She's a researcher there, and also with the Masonic Institute on the Developing Brain. Dr. Hall-Lande leads research in early identification and prevalence of autism and other developmental disabilities. She's also a clinical psychologist specializing in early identification of developmental delays in young children, and she serves as the CDC's Act Early Ambassador to Minnesota and is a lead researcher on the CDC's Autism and Developmental Disabilities Monitoring Network. And she's also a faculty on the Minnesota LEND, a fellowship program, which is Leadership Education in Neurodevelopmental Disabilities, and that's at the University of Minnesota. So my first question is, how do you have time to do anything else? But we're so glad you're here and that you took time to talk with us.
It really is a pleasure to be here.
Oh, I'm glad you could join us today. We're looking forward to hearing your information that you have. And as I read your bio and all of your background, you have you're touching a lot of areas with a common theme, autism, and supporting children and families with autism. And I have the pleasure of working with you on the Learn the Signs Act Early group that is really a monthly meeting that is pulling all of us together in Minnesota who touch children and families in different ways and care for them. And so I'm excited for you to be here today to just talk to us about your role in supporting families that are navigating this road of autism.
Absolutely. Well, again, thank you so much for having me here today. And you're exactly right. A common theme that runs through all of my different work is autism and more broadly developmental disabilities. And you invited me here today to talk about a lot of things and a lot of our connections, but one of which was you asked me to talk about one of our projects where we're really looking more closely. It's our ADDM project, which I won't speak in acronyms. It stands for Autism Developmental Disabilities Monitoring Network. And that is a project that really simply stated we count, we track the number of children with autism. It's a long-standing project. Nationally, it's been around since 2000, and it's one of the largest and long-standing projects that we have that has tracked the number of children with autism, but it also tells us some other important things, such as characteristics, and something that's near and dear to my heart, which is early identification. And I'm here today. I think what you want to hear is you want to hear me talk a little bit about what those numbers look like, both in the national numbers as well as within our state of Minnesota. If I'm correct about that, I will
definitely
keep going.
Yes, definitely. That's exactly why I think it'd be really interesting for our listeners to understand that process, because so often in the news you hear, the CDC's out with new numbers, and as you know, childcare professionals, they're hearing about that and maybe not understanding all that goes into that process.
Yes. And, just to back us up a little, and I know you have a very informed audience, but I always like to start, sometimes I get the question, what is autism? We're hearing so much about it. What is it? And really, autism is a developmental disability. It really, children with autism, they may communicate differently, interact differently, behave differently. They may learn in different ways. We all know they are very capable of learning. They bring many gifts, but they also may bring challenges in social communication, social interaction. Maybe some of the behaviors are different or more rigid or repetitive. And so that is really the group we're looking at. I also look at more broadly developmental delays, but today we are going to talk a lot about autism. So to sort of bring us back to our counting, what we look at, we say prevalence of autism. That's a public health. Basically, if I were here doing a visual presentation, I would say, we really look at the number of children with autism in our communities. In this case, we're looking closely at 8-year-olds and 4-year-olds, but I'm going to use 8-year-olds as our example today. So that's our numerator, number of children with autism, and our denominator is number of just total children with 8-year-olds in the area we're looking at. And why that's important is I talk a lot about prevalence. So your question is, what do those numbers look like? And today I'm going to flip a little bit back and forth between, we have CDC's numbers, the CDC ADDM Network. We kind of use some shorthand and say national, but it's actually 11 sites, 11 communities within the United States. People often think it's in every state and in every community, but really we're collecting data across a select group of communities, and we report those numbers. So even I may slip and say national, but just remember it's a small group of communities, but the data is really helpful. And what we're seeing within the broader ADDM network, CDC's network, is a number of 1 in 44. So if we're looking at 8-year-old children, we're saying 1 out of 44 8-year-old children are identified with autism. That comes out to a percentage of about 2.3%. Now, if we look a little more specifically at Minnesota, the numbers are 1 in 36. So even a little bit higher, around 2.8%, almost 3%. And what I like to tell people when I present on this data, and we're talking a lot about 8-year-olds because that's the group we're looking at. If you think of a typical 3rd grade class where 8-year-olds would be, almost every class would have a child with autism. So it's no longer considered a low incidence disability. Priscilla, I don't know about you, but when I was growing up, autism was a relatively low incidence disability. I might think of it as maybe I knew one child, 2. Now, it's pretty common. Most of us have a friend, a family member, a classmate, a coworker who has autism. We're seeing it much more than we used to. It's much more a part of our everyday dialogue, right? I mean, that it used to be. Yeah. And so people often ask why, why is that? And I say, a couple reasons. One, we're more aware. We're certainly more aware. Parents are more aware. Childcare providers are more aware. Researchers are more aware. Everyone, it's more a part of our regular discussion. So public awareness is definitely a piece of it. Number 2, the diagnostic criteria has changed. We now view autism as a spectrum. We see it as co-occurring with intellectual disability. Now we know that a child can have a high IQ and have autism. They can have significant communication needs and an IQ below 70 or have an intellectual disability and have autism. It's a spectrum. So we're identifying more kids, and we're also getting better at identifying kids. We know that we've improved screening. And then when I think of early childhood providers, they're better at developmental monitoring. We have better screening tools, and we have better assessment processes. So I think we can't attribute it to one factor, but one thing we think is a significant contributor is we are just getting better at identifying kids. Yeah.
One thing when you're talking about early childhood professionals and the childcare setting, when you think of, there are more children in community care too, as well. Yes. And so those professionals who are getting better at those developmental markers, they're seeing kids younger and younger in a community setting. Whereas when I was growing up, and maybe when you were growing up too, you started school when you were 5, you went to kindergarten, and that's when you notice that there may be some learning challenges or there may be some unique needs. But now we're seeing kids, infancy and beyond, and getting that opportunity for that early intervention and that ability to say, this could be it. Let's look at it in a deeper way, try to get some more answers, and then get this child some supports so that they can be successful.
Absolutely. And when I put, I lead the Autism Developmental Disabilities Monitoring Network, but I also do a lot of work with Learn the Signs Act Early, which is another public health program where we really work to identify kids earlier. And you're exactly right, Priscilla. We go to all those places that children birth to 5 are, childcare. They see their pediatricians and healthcare providers. Parents, some are in the home, but a lot are in settings where we see kids and we're able to monitor their development. It's interesting you brought that up, because I think an important part of the discussion that we talk a lot about in ACT Early, developmental delays and disabilities are remarkably common. I'm going to step a little bit outside of autism and step more into developmental delays. CDC numbers tell us that about 1 in 4 kids birth through 5, birth through 7, if we look at that early childhood year, 1 in 4 are at risk for a developmental delay. Now we think, but we think a developmental delay could be a communication delay. a
Yeah.
speech delay, a motor delay. So if we think in 1 in 4 kids are at risk that we're seeing, in, for example, in childcare settings, we also know from CDC data, if we look at kids, the broad spectrum, about 1 in 6 will wind up with some type of a developmental disability. So, it's not as rare as we thought. And it's part of the whole continuum of the children we see and the students we serve. And so I really do think of early care providers as really being on the front lines and helping us understand in terms of development, what is typical and how do we get to kids early? The research is really sound. The earlier we get to kids, and I know I'm preaching to the choir, Priscilla. I know you know this. I know your listeners. But the earlier we get to kids, the better their life outcomes. In the case of autism, I'm going to put my psychologist and my clinical hat on. With specialized training, we know we can identify kids between 18 months and 24 months. And I'm going to talk, or maybe I can talk about it right now. We're getting to kids too late. We're getting to kids, when we look at the ADDM data nationally, we're seeing that we're getting to kids with an autism clinical diagnosis around 4 years, 2 months. So even that is delayed. Do you think Minnesota is higher or lower? Do you think kids are older or younger?
Well, I would hope that it would be younger, but
unfortunately, what we're seeing with Minnesota data, we're getting to kids with the clinical diagnosis in Minnesota around 5 years, 3 months. And while we've made improvements and we've done a lot of work in that area, we also know, we know intervention at any age is a gift. If a child is identified at 5, if they're identified at 7, we get them in for services and supports. But we know there's something really powerful about those birth through 5 years. We think of the advances we see in language and communication and social development. And if we can get in early and support a child, their life outcome is significantly better. And research also tells us that often for the family, it can be better for them. They get the supports that they need. They get a community. It can be hard to get an early diagnosis for many families, but there's also a percentage of families that it also can be supportive. It can be liberating. They have a name to it and they start to understand a path forward. And I think I know all of us, I've been there as a psychologist in early intervention. Sometimes it's hard. It's hard to talk about delays, to talk about diagnoses, but we also know that there is a wealth of research literature that tells us the earlier the better, both for the child and for the family.
Yes. And oftentimes I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, the families have a feeling that there's something, and they just are often wanting someone to say, let's go find the answer to that feeling that's in your gut that says something's just not going along the way it's supposed to, or I just need to understand why this behavior keeps happening. And so that early intervention piece, that diagnosis can really be the recipe for this is what your child needs. And we're going to learn as your child grows. Of course, it's not like just one size fits all, as you've very clearly said, it's a spectrum, but it gives those answers in that pathway forward that can feel like a relief in so many situations.
Absolutely. And, when people look at the research data, in autism, not necessarily mine, but that I've looked at, I'm in the body of research every day. Yeah. And, what we see is, yes, you're right. Often parents, we see a variety of things, but often parents know, something is not right here. And often one thing we've tried to shift the dialogue, shift the narrative with Act Early and our ADDM work is that, we often hear parents say, I said to my healthcare provider, I said to my, often it's a healthcare provider, I have some concerns and we hear, I think we can say it together. Well, let's wait and see, let's wait and see, fill in the blank. He's a boy. Let's wait and see. The child is learning multiple languages. Let's wait and see. Let's not label too early. And we're slowly shifting that narrative. And maybe in some places, and we don't have tons of time, but there's, within the ADDM network, there was a state, California, that had the youngest age of identification, and they had prevalence rates around 1 in 26. And they're doing a lot with their healthcare providers in terms of educating. Let's not wait and see. Let's screen. Let's track development. Let's get in early for services and supports. And that
Right.
really, we know the earlier we get kids in, again, we'll say it together. I just keep saying it.
Yes.
I know you know it, but how
Mhm.
can we all work together? And again, childcare providers, often they know too. We talk about parents. I mean, they have their own, norm reference group. They have a class of 3-year-olds, class of 4-year-olds.
Right.
Know what a 2-year-old should be doing, what an infant should be
Yep.
doing in terms of developmental milestones, and how can they be partners with parents? I do a lot of work again in the Learn the Signs Act Early, and I do encourage anyone listening to Google that, take a look. There's a wealth of free resources there that you can look at as a childcare provider around how do you start that discussion. There's videos, because it can be a hard discussion with a parent around developmental delays. How do you incorporate developmental monitoring into your regular conferences if you're doing conferences with families? And then how do you navigate that conversation about acting early and getting kids in for more screening or assessment? There are a lot of wonderful free tools on the Learn the Signs Act Early website.
I'm so glad you brought that up. And also for our listeners too, our coaching is available. Our coaches are well versed in having those conversations with families. And we often will help early childhood educator frame it in a way that I need more information to be able to do my job and care for your child. And so let's just go in for screening and rule things out and determine, what does your child need to really have a successful day? How can we set up our environment so that we're meeting their needs in the most positive way forward? And it takes the stress off, I think, leaving it on the parents to go find the answers or the provider to find the answers. We're all going to work together in partnership to get to where we have the information that's necessary to help this child be successful.
Absolutely. You're all a team working in concert together to provide the best education for the child, individualized to their needs. And this can be a path forward in doing that. And the coaches do amazing work with that as well.
Definitely. So, Jen, can you touch a little bit about, boys and girls and autism diagnoses? I think that's something that's interesting to people, and sometimes people want to know more about that.
It's a common question we get, and I'm going to, again, go back to the research because I am a researcher. But what we see both nationally, and it's a pretty robust statistic, that we see a ratio of about 4 boys to every 1 girl. We see that within the broader autism literature. We see it in the ADDM data, the national data, and we also see a very similar stat when we look at our Minnesota data. I have a paper sitting right next to me that I need to read. I've already read the abstract. It's looking at global prevalence. They also came up with a 4-to-1 stat. So it's a very robust statistic. And so then people have questions when they hear that. So what I do is count within our project. We count. We are just telling you what we see in communities. We do get questions. Are we under-identifying girls? And I say that is a great question. It is not a question ADDM data can answer because we're just sort of looking at what's there. But there are researchers out there taking a look. What does the presentation look like in girls? And here are some of the things that we hear. A subtler presentation, girls are often identified later. They may have a different trajectory. There's a lot of different things that they're taking a look at. Are we biased as clinicians? We need to take a look. Are we likely to identify a girl with something else, of not look at it as autism? So I think there's more questions than answers, but definitely we're looking into it. We aren't just saying, wow, it's 4-to-1, end of the story, book club.
Right.
We're not saying that at all, but I will say we need to take a closer look. Where are we seeing that statistic, and why is it so consistent across different studies of autism? I think a lot of the early intervention providers, I guess I'm wondering, I can't see you, this will be played later, but I'm wondering if that's consistent with what you see as well, or teachers out in special education classrooms. Are we seeing significantly more boys than girls? If I put my clinical hat on, I was certainly seeing that a lot more in practice. But again, there are many questions around that in terms of how can we do better at identifying girls, and how can we identify them earlier?
Sure. That's so interesting, isn't it? And, as you said, researchers are digging deeper all the time to help us understand what needs to be done to support children and their optimal learning. And I think as we look at wrapping up this wonderful conversation, and Jen, I'd love to have you back another time to talk more about, other research that you're doing, or just any topic that you'd love to talk about, because
Absolutely.
I love to talk with you. You're such a great guest. But what can we do as early childhood educators across Minnesota and the nation? We have listeners all over the United States who pick up this podcast. What can we do to be more helpful to families in this search for those answers?
Great question. Great question. Well, I'm going to distill that down into 3 points, like any good researcher would do. Okay. And I will keep it brief. But here are the 3 things that I take from our ADDM research, our Autism Developmental Disabilities Monitoring Network, as well as the ACT Early work I do. 1, a key takeaway is we are identifying more children in our communities than we used to. Autism, as I said before, is a relatively common disability. And so we should be watching for the signs of it early and know how to support and navigate those conversations with families, healthcare providers, parents, I know many of you are childcare providers, it's going to come up. It just really is. When we look at numbers like that, we know that it is a part of every childcare provider's, every early interventionist experience. Yes. We also need to know we are identifying autism too late. And we all need to work together to identify it earlier. So we need to be aware of the early signs. And I'd be happy to come back and talk about that. The early signs of delays, the early signs of autism, and also how do we get families in for support, additional screening, additional testing. How do we support those systems? And number 3, with the numbers we're seeing in Minnesota, when we're looking at 1 in 36, we need our systems and support structures to respond to that. So we need to build capacity like what your coaches do, capacity within childcare centers, within early intervention settings, within schools. I mean, we are looking at shortages in every area of autism. We're here to talk about early intervention, but we spend most of our life in adulthood, and we're looking at a services system that really needs to build capacity to support the kids that we know are moving through it.
Yeah. Oh, well, those are great 3 points to be keeping in the front of our minds as professionals out there caring for children and supporting their families day to day. Thank you, Jen Hall-Lande, for being with us today. This was so packed with information, and I look forward to having you back again as a guest on another topic. And for those of you listening, you can also go to our website, inclusivechildcare.org. We have a lot of resources on autism, some other podcasts, and also go to Learn the Signs, Act Early. As Jen noted, there's a lot of wonderful resources there as well. And we just encourage all of you who are out there listening to take this opportunity to just, really be looking for where you can help a family when it comes to navigating some concerns about developmental disabilities and any concerns or lags and delays. So thank you, Jen. Look forward to talking to you sometime very soon.
Yes. Thank you, Priscilla. And thank you for the Center for Inclusive Childcare. It's been a pleasure to be with you today.
Thanks for listening. For more resources, visit us at inclusivechildcare.org.